So welcome, my name is Nicole Harvey. I'm the director of the Oklahoma History Center Museum, and I have the privilege to introduce our next session, The Magnificent Citizenship, Politics, Gender, and Race in Early Oklahoma, which will examine politics, gender, race, and the contested nature of citizenship in Oklahoma as it transitioned from territory to state. Please allow me to introduce the session's moderator, Sarah Epler-Janda, professor of history at Cameron University, is the author or co-author of several books on Oklahoma history, activism, and gender. Her work includes Beloved Woman, Prairie Power. She is active in the Western History Association and has served on multiple academic advisory boards. Dr. Janda was in the most recent class of inductees to the Oklahoma Historians Hall of Fame just this year. So I'm going to welcome her to the stage, and she will introduce the rest of the session presenters.
Thank you, and thank you for being here. You are in for a treat, because I will only say a few words as I introduce our three really amazing students of Oklahoma history. They are all three in the process of making wonderful contributions to the field, and I invite you to count on your fingers until you run out of how many new things you're about to learn about Oklahoma as you listen to their presentations today. I will go ahead and introduce all three of them and the order that they will present, and then I will get out of the way so that we can listen to them talk. A University of Oklahoma PhD student, Christine Carlson's academic research centers on women's authority in the late 19th to early 20th centuries. Christine is specifically interested in the American West and early women's movements of suffrage and professionalism, and her background in Oklahoma history has widened her interest in the intersectionality of indigenous women in the transitional statehood period. She has authored articles in the Chronicles of Oklahoma and presented at the Oklahoma History Symposium and the Mormon History Association, as well as the BYU Religious Studies Church History Symposium. Thayme Watson is a doctoral candidate at the University of Oklahoma. He is currently working on his dissertation with Dr. Ann Hyde with the hope of completing and defending this December. He's originally from South Dakota, having completed his BA in History and Political Science and MA in History at the University of South Dakota. Thayme is presenting as part of his dissertation. His dissertation examines the impact of the statehood movements in Oklahoma and the Dakotas from the 1880s to 1920, focusing particularly on women, migrants, and indigenous peoples. The piece he is presenting today examines the ideas of gender, race, and citizenship in the Oklahoma Constitutional Convention. Hope Cunningham is a master's student at the University of Oklahoma. Hope's research centers on the ways that men defined masculinity in the early 20th century Oklahoma, particularly regarding the relationship between manhood and military service during the First World War. This is the topic of her master's thesis, and her presentation today will showcase a small portion of this research. Please help me welcome Christine to the podium.
Thank you so much for attending our panel today. And I want to start out by acknowledging that my topic is a very complicated and deep one, and I have 15 minutes to present it to you. And so I'm acknowledging from the outset that there's a lot more to say than I have time to say it. And so there's definitely more research that needs to be done on these questions. In state building at the start of the 20th century, Oklahoma presented a blank slate for those interested in imposing a government structure on a deeply contested space. The Indian Removal Act created Indian Territory in 1830 to establish space, quote, for the reception of such tribes or nations of Indians as may choose to exchange the lands where they now reside, unquote, and promised that the United States would, quote, forever secure and guarantee to them and their heirs or successors the country so exchanged with them, unquote. I forgot to advance the slide. I hope it will work. It maybe won't. Thayme, do you want to work on this while I keep talking? But while the indigenous nations had been driven from Georgia and Florida and Tennessee to what is now Oklahoma, when they had suffered the loss of life, home, and lifeways, and when they had worked to reestablish a life and culture deemed more acceptable to the American government, they were not the only group desiring land in Indian Territory. Slowly, over the century, indigenous land holdings were eroded in a series of laws that were essentially land grabs until in 1889, the first land run resulted in a legalized redistribution of the long-promised lands from the nations to settlers from the east. By the time Oklahoma Territory was officially established in the 1890 Organic Act, what would become Oklahoma was a contested place, claimed by indigenous nations, white settlers, African Americans, boomers, cattlemen, railroad companies, and many more. The formation of the Sequoyah and Oklahoma constitutions proposed solutions to competing claims by structuring governments, prioritizing economic and land claims, and in outlining suffrage rights to define who would and would not be invited to the state building project. Women's stories are difficult to extract from archival narratives that privilege male perspectives. Although their stories are hard to find, indigenous women lived in Oklahoma prior to the Indian Removal Act, and more arrived after the United States government forced removal of native nations from eastern lands. White women accompanied their settler husbands and participated in claiming indigenous lands made recently available through the allotment process. Black women brought families to the territories in search of freedom from racial violence and an opportunity for safety and possibility. While these women did not debate on the floors of the Sequoyah and Oklahoma Statehood Conventions, they influenced these events and their eventual constitutional outcomes in various ways, both political and personal. By the time each convention had produced a constitution, Sequoyah had left the door to women's suffrage open, writing into their document a popular vote on the question at first opportunity, while Oklahoma had slammed the door on women's suffrage firmly shut, disenfranchising women in its founding document. My research of the Sequoyah Convention of 1905 and the Oklahoma Convention of 1906 investigates how the question of women's suffrage contributed to the complicated act of state building that occurred in each convention. Looking specifically for women's voices, I ask how women sought to influence events in each convention, where they found allies, and why they achieved nominal and temporary success at Sequoyah that they could not achieve at the Oklahoma Convention. Finally, I ask the complicated question, how does the confluence of racially defined imaginings of the state of Oklahoma complicate the story of women's pursuit of suffrage as Indian Territory and then Oklahoma outlined their political structures? This allows me to reveal questions that lingered after statehood on how indigeneity and blackness impacted sovereignty and citizenship, and how women's unique state-defined role shaped how women could respond. In doing this work, I draw heavily on the recent work of Don Fixico's recent The State of Sequoyah, as well as resources from the Oklahoma Historical Society. Overlapping the timelines of the Oklahoma women's suffrage movement, and if you'll advance for me, Thayme, thank you. The Sequoyah Convention and Oklahoma statehood reveals how and when Oklahoma women began organizing to win suffrage. Oklahoma women actually voted in the first territorial election on April 23, 1889, when in the rush to organize the territory, women were accidentally included. They voted for mayor, sheriff, and other officials. But the May 2, 1890 Organic Act specified that women would not vote in territorial Oklahoma. On October 10, 1890, the WCTU facilitated the floor speech of Alice Williams of Missouri, who made the first public appeal for women's suffrage in Oklahoma Territory. Though local women continued to meet, speak, and organize chapters, no official progress was achieved during the territorial period. NASA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, began organizing chapters in Oklahoma and Indian Territories in 1895, and by December 15, 1904, they had combined the twin territory organizations into one equal suffrage association of Oklahoma and Indian Territory. During the territorial period, women continually advanced for women's suffrage, or advocated, for women's suffrage, and in 1899, the suffragists pushed a bill through the Territorial House of Representatives, but were defeated in the Territorial Council by a filibuster. The suffragists claimed to have been betrayed by a supportive council member who they believed had been bribed to change his vote. Carrie Chapman Catt of NASA claimed, quote, "Saloons all over Oklahoma with a remarkable unanimity of knowledge boasted beforehand that the bill was killed and that this man was the instrument which they had used," close quote. The saloon industry was staunchly anti-women's suffrage due to the movement's ties to prohibition. Despite their losses, women continued to organize conventions, speak, and write publicly and privately. Suffrage women could see that Indian and Oklahoma territories were moving toward statehood, and they continued to build their organizations and relationships with legislators who would construct the political apparatus of the future state. When the Sequoia movement resulted in a convention that would write a constitution, women were in and around Muskogee lobbying the lawmakers to include them in the state project. One newspaper article reveals that agitation surrounded suffrage at Sequoia and describes how, quote, women are taking much interest in the work of the convention and its several committees, many of them being well-versed, unquote. The article claims that the possibility of including women's suffrage in the Sequoia Convention began as a joke with Delegate D.H. Whitaker of Tahlequah. Women, however, took the prospect of suffrage seriously. When the suffrage committee considered which members of Indian Territory should vote, suffragists lobbied for inclusion, and the suffrage committee of the Sequoia Convention received a greater influx of community input than any other, making their, quote, considerable time in receiving lady callers, unquote. When the suffrage question was called at the Sequoia Convention on September 8, 1905, spirited discussion took place. The conclusion was the recommendation that, quote, the legislature shall extend the rights of suffrage to women which cannot be effective unless the consent of the majority of the voters, unquote. The convention voted to let the question be decided by popular vote, and the Sequoia Constitution states that the General Assembly shall, at the first session thereof, enact laws to extend the right of suffrage to women of rightful age. The Equal Suffrage Association held their annual convention in Chickasha in 1905 at the close of the convention to make plans for an aggressive campaign for suffrage with resolutions, quote, demanding a suffrage clause in the Constitution of the new state, unquote. This suggests that seeing a brief opening with the possible acceptance of the Sequoia Constitution, women were pinning their hopes to Sequoia as a possible opportunity for suffrage. These women hoped for their inclusion in the new state of Sequoia, and combining the efforts of the Oklahoma and Indian Territory suffrage associations leveraged their influence by growing their ranks. The suffragists' hopes, along with the Sequoia delegates and all in support, ended in disappointment. The June 1906 Oklahoma Enabling Act effectively dismissed the Sequoia Constitution and mandated that a new state of Oklahoma be formed from the combined Indian and Oklahoma territories. The suffragists then pivoted to Guthrie to apply pressure on the delegates to the Oklahoma State Convention, the gathering mandated by Congress that would have the final word on women's suffrage in its constitution. The women remembered Susan B. Anthony's 1904 exhortation that, quote, if Oklahoma comes into the Union without suffrage in its constitution, it will take a long time and a great deal of hard work to convince over 1/2 of the men to vote for it, unquote. The women worked diligently to convince the delegates to support suffrage. The Guthrie Daily Leader reported, quote, the women who are here lobbying in the interests of female suffrage have been very active, and scarcely an hour in the day passes but what they may be seen with several delegates cornered making an attempt to convert them to their side of the proposition, unquote. Over the course of 1906, the Suffrage Association's membership rolls swelled by 31%. The suffragists traveled throughout both territories, distributing pamphlets, building floats for parades, and participating in fairs. As James Wright argues, quote, to answer the oft-repeated charge that most women really cared little about voting, the Oklahoma City suffragettes conducted an extensive campaign to get women to register and vote in city school elections. The suffragists were determined to have their voices heard. The Oklahoma Convention convened in 1906, and on December 11th, the Suffrage Committee heard arguments regarding women's suffrage for the new Constitution. Mary C. Bradford testified of her experiences as a female voter in Colorado, while NASA organizer Dr. Francis Wood argued that female laborers deserved more control over political issues that affected their labor. On a single day, the convention was presented with 83 petitions with 24,000 signatures in favor of women's suffrage. But despite the efforts of the previous decade, suffragists were defeated when the suffrage committee returned to the convention with a recommendation for male suffrage only. Now they had suffered a double defeat in 2 years. While successful in keeping suffrage as a possibility in Sequoia, that state's defeat in the U.S. Congress combined with women's exclusion in the Oklahoma State Constitution meant their battle was not over. The Oklahoma suffragists found a powerful ally in Robert Owen, a member of the Cherokee Nation and a delegate to the Sequoia Convention, who would become one of Oklahoma's first 2 senators. Suffragists recognized in Owen an influential ally with power and influence in both Indian and Oklahoma territories, But it was actually a woman who structured and informed Owen's stance on women's suffrage. Owen's mother, Narcissa, was a revered and respected Cherokee educator, and she exemplified the ways in which Native identity informed and structured politics for women suffragists. George D. Smithers writes that Owen exemplified, quote, the malleable ways in which Cherokees have historically understood and articulated their identities and collective history that has enabled generation after generation of Cherokee people to reimagine what it meant and continues to mean to be Cherokee and to revivify attachments to community, land, language, and culture, unquote. In her memoir, Owen wrote of her Scotch-Irish Cherokee identity and past, and as a young widow, she was primarily responsible for teaching these principles to her son, Robert Owen. Narcissa was born and educated in the Cherokee Nation and was served as a delegate to the NASA Convention in 1910, reflecting her support of suffrage. It's clear from Robert's political positions that the two were in agreement about suffrage, among other things. Robert called on his mother as the impetus for his conviction, saying, quote, every principle of worth of which I have possessed, I drew from her, unquote. In a St. Louis Dispatch article in 1909, Robert outlined his reasons for supporting women's suffrage. He concluded, quote, woman as a human being is entitled to the rights of any other human being, unquote. Because Oklahoma was a deeply contested space with indigenous white and black populations claiming land, belonging, and agency, the women's suffrage question became entangled with state building, reflecting an intersectionality of race and gender that ultimately excluded women from the state building project. While the state of Sequoia evidenced an attempt of the Native nations to retain authority in land, it included women's political participation. The white settler imaginings of Oklahoma, in contrast, excluded women from the state building project. Meanwhile, black settlers in Oklahoma and freed people both from eastern and southern states and those descended from the freed slaves of Native peoples in Oklahoma also fought for participation and authority in the new state. In 1905, the Indian Territory Suffrage League called their own convention to argue for their inclusion in the separate state plan. The Muskogee Democrat reported on September 29, 1905, that the convention's endorsement of Sequoia resolved that, quote, the colored people of Indian Territory, after many years of business and social intercourse with the Indians and white people of the Indian Territory, believe the interests of our race and this association can best be conserved by combining our efforts and the operations of this association solely to Indian Territory. Because, quote, the Sequoia Constitution gives equal suffrage rights to all people regardless of race, color, or previous conditions. African Americans in Indian Territory clearly envisioned their inclusion in the state of Sequoia and therefore lent their support to the construction of a state that would allow their participation. African American fears of exclusion in the new state of Oklahoma were well-founded. Oklahoma Territory had segregated its schools in 1897, and the Oklahoma State Convention would work to implement miscegenation and segregation laws along with voting restrictions. Though all racial restrictions weren't written into the Constitution, they were codified in Senate Bill 1 as Jim Crow laws. Charles Haskell noted that segregation was not included in the Constitution because of the risks it presented. Quote, when faced with the alternative of placing such provisions in the Constitution and taking the chances of offending the president, who might be prevailed upon to hold that such provisions were in violation of the Enabling Act and the Constitution of the United States, or leaving it out to be settled by the legislators, it was decided to leave it out. Unquote. The Negro Protective League organized to protest the constitutional restrictions, even meeting with President Theodore Roosevelt to request he reject the Constitution. But efforts were fruitless, and with the rejection of Sequoia and the adoption of the Oklahoma Constitution, African American Oklahomans lost unrestricted political enfranchisement. The women's suffrage question reflected these racial divides. In addition to arguments about women's capabilities and responsibilities, those debating considered the question of racial inclusion alongside questions of gender. Delegates questioned how gender inclusion would impact demands to include African Americans in the political project. Some warned of the dangers of women's participation in politics. In the debate on the floor over suffrage, Delegate Charles H. Pittman, quote, managed to blame the Civil War on the cry of women of the North to free the slaves, unquote, concluding that this evidenced the problems inherent in granting women suffrage. The tie between women and abolitionism, one of women's formative political causes, convinced this delegate, as well as other delegates from the South, that women's political participation caused trouble. William H. Murray later reminisced that on February 5, 1907, when the convention voted on women's suffrage, a school board election was held in Guthrie, with one polling place visible from City Hall where the delegates met. He claimed that the observing delegates noted that 758 women voted, with only 7 of that number being white. However, historian Louise Boyd James does not find evidence for an election in Guthrie that day, but nearly 2 months later, the Guthrie Daily Leader noted that the vote of colored women quote, the vote of colored women for school board members is unusually heavy, unquote. Therefore, Murray claims that delegates witnessed that granting women's suffrage would greatly extend African American political power in the new state, a risk they were unwilling to take. The contestations over Oklahoma that arose between forcibly removed indigenous peoples and the white and black settlers that both imagined Indian Territory and now the new state of Oklahoma reflected how women both participated in the political movement and active state building and complicated it, despite all efforts to keep women's influence out. Through their own lobbying, their personal influence on delegates, their organizing, gathering petitions, and speaking out, women shaped the way arguments over enfranchisement were conceived by those imagining a state of Oklahoma. Additionally, indigenous and African American people in Oklahoma also influenced the ways the state was built through its constitution by challenging definitions of enfranchisement and participation, claiming rights of citizenship that delegates had to either accept or deny. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Thayme Watson. I'm in the middle of this panel, and so I get to do the fun job of kind of transitioning from a lot of the context that Chrissy just provided and some of the issues that Hope will discuss after myself. I wanted us to take a little bit of time to think about one of these sources in particular. Chrissy noted it a few times, but I want to think about, take this time for us to think about how to approach topics that involve race and gender in contexts where discussions of those endeavors become increasingly more difficult. So I want to kind of model that a little bit by examining a document and source where those themes may not be obvious but are very, very present. And so that's with the proceedings of the Constitutional Convention of the proposed state of Oklahoma, starting in 1906 to 1907. It's something that is very readily available, can be useful teaching material. And so to begin, why this document, why this moment as the territory of Oklahoma and Indian Territory becomes the state of Oklahoma. It's a place and these conventions for ideas, for plans, for notions of what this space will be, who is a part of it, and moreover, in some cases, who may not be a part of it. And so these are some of the questions I want us to think about a little bit. So really quickly, just some big picture context on state constitutions. They are modeled after the federal constitution. Prior to you have a large number of states joining the Union prior to the Civil War. You have Reconstruction states after Reconstruction, and also formerly Confederate states who have to rewrite their constitutions, including the Reconstruction amendments. And then you have a number of states in the West, like North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, Wyoming, in 1889 and 1890, who are adopting their constitutions and becoming states. And so Oklahoma is really looking at all these different time periods and kind of waves of constitutions of Western states, of Reconstruction states, and then kind of northern states, and we'll see some of the people talking about that in just a moment. But really quickly, thinking about these constitutions and where Oklahoma fits in the context of other states, they're able to view this period as one of opportunity, one of trying out maybe novel and new ideas, and kind of dealing with some of these parameters, most notably with the 14th Amendment in the federal constitution, this notion of, or language of citizenship being attached to constitutions. So there's two relevant differences for this, the citizenship piece, but then also an interest in including kind of progressive era ideas, including women's suffrage and temperance, into a state constitution. So Chrissy just did an excellent job talking about women's suffrage in Oklahoma and kind of the territorial period. I just wanted to highlight a few things that are useful for kind of the reading of the document. The Statehood Constitutional Convention is a key opportunity. If it's in the state constitution, it is law. It is something that can't be changed or rescinded as easily. So it's a very kind of clear goal that a lot of suffragists are aspiring to make happen. However, despite plenty of supporters, there are kind of two key figures or opponents of that, which is the convention president, William Murray, or Alfalfa Bill, and then the Democratic Majority Leader, Charles Haskell. And so you have, as noted, a very divided interest regarding suffrage with both proponents and opponents in the same space. The other piece that I think is useful to think about this going into the State of Oklahoma Constitutional Convention is what happens with the Sequoia Convention in 1905, facing dissolution of tribal governments and lands with the Curtis Act from 1898. A lot of tribes are very interested in creating their own state. After that is stalled by Congress. The single state of Oklahoma becomes the primary goal, but two key features come from that, which is the Sequoia Convention, or the Sequoia Constitution, serves as a template for the Oklahoma Constitution, including some of those issues that transfer over, notably suffrage and temperance, for our sake. And a large number, half of the delegates to the Oklahoma Convention are from representing Indian Territory, with 55 delegates representing Oklahoma Territory, 55 representing Indian Territory, and then 2 get delegates from the Osage Nation, comprising those people who are present. So I just wanted to read a few pieces here from the proceedings themselves. And just as we're going through that, I want to have 2 major questions for you to think about. So in a convention where all the delegates are male, where are women present, okay? And then who is, I've highlighted pieces that are talking about citizenship. So these ideas of who are they thinking about as a citizen who gets to be an Oklahoman, okay? These are all quotes from the wonderful talker and wonderful source of Alfalfa Bill Murray, who was president of convention. So these are quotes from, first 2 are from kind of the first day of the convention. He's the second speaker. He is elected very shortly afterwards, the president of the convention. So just kind of, I'll read these out loud. But remember, he is very instrumental in stopping suffrage from becoming part of the Oklahoma Constitutional Convention, okay? So first bit, do not let us make a one-sided constitution, but let us make it as broad as the entire citizenship of the state. And then the other piece, we want to say that we have here representatives from every state in the union. And coming here as we do, we shall not establish institutions modeled after those of the extreme south, nor on the other hand, shall we attempt to establish institutions peculiar to the extreme north, but we shall modify each with the other, and agreeably harmonize the whole into newer, grander citizenship that represents no section, but becomes the magnificent citizenship, the manhood and womanhood of greater Oklahoma. Cue title slide for our panel. And then the last piece is nearly a year later, in 1907, nearing the end of the convention process. For a multitude of reasons, Murray has kept the draft or the transcript of the Oklahoma's proposed constitution he's delayed the filing of it, likely to prevent changes for it or letting it go back to a vote. So he is accused, and kind of becomes a scandal that he's holding out of the Constitution and not letting it proceed. So this last piece, the efforts of the people to be free, that may be necessary before the honest citizens of Oklahoma, and I include in that the rank and file of all political parties, will be able to come in possession of their own and secure what is theirs by inherent right of citizenship by their votes, as intended by the act of Congress and the proclamation of the president admitting it, or admitting the state. I have a few things highlighted. It's a little bit bigger. Sorry about text and reading, but just there's a few pieces of language that I think are really interesting because Murray is intentionally or unintentionally thinking about the future of Oklahoma and Oklahomans in gendered and engendered terms, right? So it's not just manhood, it's the womanhood of greater Oklahoma, this grander citizenship, this notion that the people will become a part of something greater and what that the future shall entail, okay? It's a statewide citizenship, and then kind of in the last piece, secure what is theirs by inherent right of citizenship by their votes, right? I think the last piece is a very interesting kind of contradiction of, rights of citizenship, securing votes, but, that is coded as something that is for men in the state, right? That is for the male citizenry, not for the female citizenry. Really quickly, I can't show all of it because Murray is long-winded and has a lot, but there's also components that are racialized. Chrissy noted this is also a space where delegates are very interested in establishing Jim Crow legislation. They're very interested in kind of this separate but equal Plessy versus Ferguson school system, rail cars. That's how they're envisioning what will be the state of Oklahoma. But those markers of race are applied to people of African descent in Oklahoma and not necessarily people who are native in the state. Okay, so those racial markers are being used for black residents, but not for native residents. He goes into bits and pieces about using the language of savagery and civilized, especially regarding the 5 tribes. And so this notion of citizenship is kind of also something that subsumes or incorporates kind of ideas of native citizenship. So there's also ideas of assimilation at play and who can be part of this, with the 5 tribes especially, with half the convention being from Indian territory, kind of gives a little bit more to who can be and I guess who is not envisioned as part of this state. And to kind of wrap things up, kind of this question of where are women present? You have a lot of petitions, as Chrissy mentioned. My math is a little bit different from hers, but again, you have maybe over 200 or 2,000 signatures, petitions. Suffrage is most likely kind of the biggest, it's the issue that draws kind of the biggest public support, discussion, dialogue, reasons to write your convention delegate in here. You also have a number of speeches and pieces that are there, and these petitions in favor are coming from places like Norman, Chickasha, Fairland, Granite, Elk City, Enid, but they're also kind of organized from trade unions in the territory, and there's also some from Prague High School. So you have high schoolers who are very interested in what's happening as well. But regardless, it's very evident that women are present. This idea of a gendered space of Oklahoma is something that is very, very implicit in what Murray and the delegates are discussing, but also in their efforts for what Oklahoma will look like. Just to kind of wrap things up, there are a lot of intersections between race and gender in how early Oklahoma plays out with suffragists and the grandfather clause, the immediate enactment of Jim Crow policies in Oklahoma as a result of Plessy versus Ferguson, or in line with that notion. But kind of most of all, just to wrap things up, and I'll let Hope continue, is there's something interesting about honing in on a specific source like this, again, the journal proceedings, have a lot of, they're mostly written like this. They don't have too much dialogue aside from some speeches, but it's a source that I think is very instructive on, or can still be very instructive on some of these ideas that are maybe not as apparent as it may seem. So thank you for your time. I'll let Hope wrap things up.
All right, so I'm going to take us about 10 years forward in time from Thayme's presentation to talk about the World War I era. So, to begin, on August 3rd, 1917, several hundred tenant farmers in 5 eastern Oklahoma counties took up arms against the government. They were members of an organization called the Working Class Union, or WCU, and they aimed to put an end to the federal draft policy that demanded that they leave their homes to fight in the First World War. The participants in this event, now known as the Green Corn Rebellion, had many motives for undertaking this violence, one of which was the belief that it was their masculine duty as fathers and husbands to remain home to economically support their families. The unprofitable nature of tenant farming, a form of agricultural labor in which individuals leased the land they farmed in order to, in exchange for a portion of their crop, left many farmers and their families in dire economic positions. Thus, in the eyes of the rebels, the need to stay at home trumped any manly duty to join the military and protect the country, a more popular understanding of masculine expression during the period. However, many in Oklahoma saw the rebellion in a different light. Within hours of the rebellion's outbreak, men across the eastern half of the state mobilized to suppress the rebellion, at times citing their own understandings of masculinity when writing about their choice to do so. Such men used the statewide backlash to the rebellion to reinforce their own masculinity in 2 key ways. First, by casting the rebels and any other person who opposed the draft as inadequately masculine, and second, by joining vigilante policies to act out a version of military masculinity that was otherwise unavailable to them due to familial status or age. Regardless of the rebels' internal motivations, those outside the group produced alternative explanations for the rebellion based on their own understanding of the motivations behind draft resistance, a practice they saw as incompatible with proper masculinity. George Ellsworth, the editor of the Norman Democrat Topic, authored a poem regarding the rebellion, directly accusing the rebels of cowardice and unpatriotic behavior, equating the two. It reads as follows and is projected beside me. I am strong and brawny, my muscles are like corded steel. I swing the axe and follow the plow all day long in the field. My body is perfect, full 6 feet tall, but my brain's like a pigeon's egg and my heart's the size of a tennis ball. I'm a coward in my legs. Full brave I am when with others of my kind, I can slip through the night, terrorize women and children, and destroy with dynamite. I spit upon my country's flag and seek to help her foes. A very brave man I can be when I feel no blows. Why should I fight in mud and water in the trench? I hate the noise of the battle. I dread the scream of flying shell. The machine guns bark and rattle. I shriek from the rifle ball's shrill whine. The sight of flowing blood, the tremors crawl along my spine. Each hair on end is stood. I will not be drafted to the front. I will not volunteer. I'll do my fighting with my mouth, and I'll do it all right here. The early lines of this poem refer directly to the physical characteristics of tenant farmers and the brawn gained from the intense agricultural labor that such men undertook. But both the rebels and those who supported them viewed muscularity as inherently manly. However, for Ellsworth, this was the only count on which one could consider the rebels properly masculine. In every other sense, they were the opposite of men. They were cowards. They were so terrified of battle that rather than protecting the country's women and children, they terrorized them and destroyed their community. However, even this they refused to do in broad daylight, only operating under cover of night and when surrounded by other rebels, lacking the boldness to take responsibility for their actions and open themselves up to immediate retaliation. The accuracy of Ellsworth's depiction of the rebels was beside the point. It did not matter that the rebels had complex motivations that stretched far beyond the fear of battle, or that engaging in open rebellion was far from the most obvious option if someone wanted to avoid conflict. His statement served to publicly disparage them for their lack of patriotism, and by virtue of that, manhood. Another article expressing a similar sentiment appeared in the same issue of the Norman Democrat topic. The author of this article asserted that, quote, "the best American manhood is sacrificing itself for patriotic and humane principles, while those like the Green Corn rebels were at home, engaging in treason." This placed a clear juxtaposition between notions of military masculinity and whatever understanding of masculinity that the rebels claimed to hold. To be a good man was to be a, quote, "good citizen," and these, quote, traitors were nothing of the sort. Such rhetoric yet again reinforced the idea that masculinity and patriotism were inseparable. It was a man's duty to defend his nation, as the best American men did. Instead, the Green Corn rebels and others who opposed conscription were, quote, "a menace to the republic, defilers rather than protectors." Law enforcement officials also made allegations in the media regarding the rebels' lack of masculine responsibility. Offers in McAllister stated to the press regarding their searches of the rebels' homes, quote, that in the most instances there was not a pair of women's shoes to be found in the house and no newspapers. In simplest terms, by the officers' estimations, the rebels were unmarried and uneducated. However, the author of the article argued, had these men received a proper education, they would have grown into loyal patriots. This is an interesting argument, as it equates patriotism, education, and adherence to masculine norms. In the views of the officers and the article's author, and presumably many in eastern Oklahoma, the fact that some of the men who participated in the rebellion had not yet established households and families confirmed that they were lacking in masculinity, thus explaining their rebellious behavior. The fact that many other rebels were familial providers who wanted to remain home to continue in that role conveniently did not appear in such narratives. These characterizations of the rebels as men who shirked popular understandings of patriotic military masculinity, or perhaps even other forms of masculinity, reinforced the idea that those who acted against them were intensely masculine. While the rebels might behave as cowards who, quote, spit on their country's flag, the vigilantes who responded to the rebellion bravely defended their nation by ending this reign of terror and protecting the same women and children that the rebels threatened. These vigilantes may not have been serving in the war, but by acting in opposition to the rebellion, they were embodying the exact type of masculinity that the rebels lacked. This was certainly the opinion of A.G. Axline, a Henrietta man who wrote to Governor Robert Williams a week after the rebellion about the need for the formation of a home guard in Oklahoma County. Governor Williams opposed the idea of calling in the National Guard to suppress anti-draft activity in the state, instead preferring to deputize groups of civilians to form county militias or home guards. Axline informed the governor that he wanted to protect his community, but he could not join the military as he, quote, had a wife, a baby, and not sufficient of this world's goods to provide for them should he go to war. Interestingly, this justification was identical to those given by some of the Green Corn rebels for their own opposition to joining the military. Men could receive an exemption under the Selective Service Act in such circumstances, but this did not mean that every man with dependents did. This created a situation where men like Axline could escape the war while still retaining a societally ordained masculine status, and others in similar situations could not. Certainly, Axline saw his draft exemption as justified. He stated that he wanted to form the Home Guard because the workers of the county's, quote, labor element are not the material that makes desirable citizens, and the majority of them are WCU members. And since he could not fulfill his masculine duty to the country overseas, he, quote, would like to do his little bit here. This statement both degraded rebel masculinity and reinforced vigilante masculinity, explicitly placing the two in opposition to each other. When speaking of Oklahoma County's, quote, labor element, Axline was referring to the county's union members, some of whom were members of the WCU, a labor union for tenant farmers, and more importantly, the organization behind the Green Corn Rebellion. Following the rebellion, people across the state conflated the WCU with other of the state's labor unions due to their shared relationship with the Socialist Party. At this time, the Socialist Party was the third largest political party in Oklahoma, garnering support from close to a sixth of the state's voters. The Socialist Party was broadly opposed to conscription, but they were far less violent in their opposition than the Green Corn rebels. To be sure, all who opposed the draft, including those belonging to labor unions and the Socialist Party, lacked the forms of patriotism demanded by the dominant culture of the state, the most important marker of which being support for the war and, when applicable, registration for the draft. However, this does not entirely account for the meaning of Axline's statement that opponents of conscription were not, quote, desirable citizens. This is a variation on a more common statement that rebels were not, quote, responsible citizens. In a culture where irresponsibility was incompatible with proper manhood, such a statement served as an attempt to emasculate those who participated in the rebellion. While less direct, Axline appealed to the same idea, that those who chose not to submit to the draft were performing manhood incorrectly by not engaging in proper patriotism. The rebels' purported lack of desirability as citizens also allowed Axline to advocate for their extermination, the exact thing he did when he requested government permission to form a militarized body to hunt them down. Axline was not the only person to believe that engaging in vigilantism or civilian policing made an individual more manly. Local media sources lauded the, quote, virile patriotism of men like Axline, equating an individual's virility, a marker of masculinity, with a preferable expression of pro-government sentiment. These two groups of men, the vigilantes and those they targeted, shared much of the same view of what it meant to correctly perform masculinity, but in the context of war, this notion of patriotic masculinity, one that prioritized the protection of one's nation over the protection and preservation of one's family and neighbors, won out over all other markers. Where Axline chose not to join the military due to his familial status, many other men could not enlist due to their age. In similarity to Axline, men too old to serve in the armed forces used vigilantism and the formation of home guards as a vessel to come as close as possible to military masculinity. Those who held this understanding of masculinity placed an emphasis on the protection of vulnerable populations. W.A.J. Brown of Asher, Oklahoma, wrote to Governor Williams that the sooner the government allowed the formation of a home guard near the border between Seminole and Pottawatomie counties, quote, the better it will be for our women, children, and country. He requested the government supply each man in the militia with several weapons, including one good pistol and a scabbard to fight the rebels. Other older Oklahomans saw the situation similarly. R.G. Pitzer of Pawnee County informed the governor that he and his fellow community members felt that, quote, since many of our young men have gone to the front and many others will go soon, it is up to we older people to protect the homes. Similarly, Usher Carlson, a man from Miami, Oklahoma, wrote to Governor Williams, quote, we who have sons in the war fighting for our liberty begin to feel the sting of this war, and we also feel that it is our duty at home to help our government in the best manner possible. He requested of the governor, quote, let us at home show the boys in the trenches that we are willing to protect our people at home and help them to win the war. Younger men protected the nation by fighting the Germans in Europe. The Green Corn Rebellion and the backlash it brought to all Oklahomans who opposed conscription gave men like Pitzer and Carlson an opportunity to provide protection on a smaller scale. This had much to do with the patriotism of the era, with men endeavoring to support those in the military by completing the tasks that they could not while in Europe, but it had just as much to do with masculinity. Pitzer and Carlson did not need to speak of the socially entrenched duties of manhood directly to make an appeal to them. In equating themselves to those serving in Europe and speaking of the need for protection, their intention was clear. Whether it was in a letter to the governor, a column in a local newspaper, or some other format less easily preserved, men across Oklahoma used the rebellion as a way to speak about their own relationship to manhood. Defining it both by what it was and what it was not, Oklahomans carved out a definition of manhood that was deeply entrenched in notions of patriotism and an alignment with the Oklahoma and United States governments. The fact that others in the state directly disagreed with their definition, that they saw masculinity in an entirely different light, did not matter. if they disagreed so strongly, then perhaps they were truly not men at all. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for those wonderful presentations. We've got about 8 minutes for some questions, and we have a microphone that will be coming around. So we've got one in the back.
Hi. In the 1970s, I was home on Christmas from grad school, and I got a call from a volunteer for the League of Women Voters who was campaigning for the ERA. Her name was Frida Ameringer. She was the co-founder of the largest socialist movement per capita in Oklahoma. She and her husband Oscar tried to calm down the Green Corn rebellions and warn them. And I'd be curious to see, did you come across information on her and the role she played or anything like that? And if not, how could we get the attention paid to her that she really, really deserves from such an incredible leader as in Oklahoma, all the way up to the Jesse Jackson campaign?
Hi, thank you so much for your question. Absolutely. A lot of my research includes the activism of both Oscar and Frida Ameringer, though I will grant that you do see Oscar's name coming up a lot more, that most of the writings you see on Frida are, in affiliation with the writings of Ameringer and his socialist newspaper and things like that. I totally agree that highlighting the role of women in the socialist organizing of early Oklahoma is very important, because there were many women, including Frida Ameringer, Kate Richards O'Hare, and many, many others who were active in this and are perhaps not as commonly highlighted.
Okay, other questions?
Oh, you're going to make me really walk across the room here. Oh, I was just teasing.
So, question for Mr. Watson. The line that Alfalfa Bill said about not being a extreme southern state in the policy, but not adapting that of the extreme north, was that part of his general long-windedness, or was that part of something that was kind of going on in the convention about not being southern or not being northern or a little in between? Thank you.
So, I'm sorry, there's one by me I can grab if you want. Thank you. I think part of it comes from when Oklahoma is seeking admittance and crafting its constitution, it has kind of a history of other parts of the country and other states to look at, right? And so I think the extreme south is referring to the Confederacy, some of the neighboring states, and how their process of kind of forming constitutions again or revising their constitutions after Reconstruction. I think the extreme north bit is likely coming from I don't know what the right word is, the legacy of maybe some Confederate sympathies in, or fairly reasonable federal government sentiments from the tribes. And so I think he's really kind of playing on those, there's a history of what, the South has done, there's a history of what the North has done, there's kind of what more recent Western and Southwestern states have done that I think he's trying to place Oklahoma in. And I think, yes, it's long-windedness because it's Murray, but that's fun. But I think a lot of that is kind of trying to, set Oklahoma on the same level as the other states in a sense, right? So they will be part of the Union. They have something that is unique to that. There's something kind of very Turnerian of what Murray is saying, which I think is interesting as well, but I think that's what a lot of that can be attributed to.
think we have time for maybe one more question.
I recognize that there are probably so many incidents, individual experiences that are not reflected in the story of race in Oklahoma. My mother, for instance, in 1950 was the first African American to seek a master's degree at the University of Oklahoma. And she went to class and she was separated from all the other students who were in the classroom, and she sat outside. And eventually, her classmates would come out to have class with her. But there's so many incidents like this in breaking down the Jim Crow laws that existed. And then in 1959, my brothers and I were one of 3 of 8 students who integrated Northeast High School for the first time. I mean, just so many incidents in so many families, in so many places in Oklahoma that are not recorded or talked about, but that are part of the fabric of Oklahoma and in Oklahoma's position as predominantly a red state. And so I wonder if, and I'm certain you all did, I know the Oklahoma History Center has done significant research in terms of other important events. The Dowell family, for instance, who fought vigorously for integration of schools in Oklahoma. I mean, so many incidents. And so I just hope that as our history is written and recorded, that there can be a wider call for more stories or more reflections of how we went from this place to this place. And I think it's an important part of our story. That's all.
So if we could do just one quick last question. I know we got started a few minutes late, but I wanted to ask Chrissy a question if I could. How do you deal with the female anti-suffragists as you focus on these women's arguments for why they should have the right to vote?
Yeah, so Dr., and I'm horrible at saying her name, Dr. Suni Kodunthara, thank you, wrote a really fabulous, doctoral dissertation that became another project about the anti-suffragists. And so I think that's a really important complication here too. Dr. Hyde chairs some of our committees, and she always likes to say it's a really complicated question, so I very much adopt that here. There are a lot of things going on and a lot of different forces working. There were a lot of women who said that there was a narrative that women didn't want the vote that I tried to address with the quote that women were very actively organizing and actively trying to win that right in the state, but that certainly was not true for all women who saw this as a threat. We can go back to this cult of true womanhood and the threats there that we can even kind of discuss that are happening right now as well. So, yeah.
All right. Well, a round of applause for our fabulous panelists, please.